like a buttercup. You're a Barbie doll. Show them all what I'm made of. Strut down the hall. Won't stop till I get enough.
Hey there, welcome back for another deep dive. Today, we're going to be looking at something that really caught my eye recently. It's kind of the intersection of COVID relief funds in the music industry and some pretty wild spending habits. So we're going to be digging into this Vice news article called Lil Wayne and Chris Brown, accused of using COVID-19 relief grant to buy millions in luxury items. Yeah, you heard that right. It looks like some big names in music may have used pandemic relief money for things like private jets and luxury hotels, and get this, even atmosphere models. So to unpack all this, I've got our expert here who can give us some more background on the program itself and these allegations.
Well, you know, the interesting thing is the program itself, the Small Business Association's Shuttered Venue Operators Grant, or SVOG, it was created with really good intentions. You know, it was supposed to help these independent venues and artists, you know, like the people who are really the backbone of the music scene, the ones that were really struggling because of the pandemic lockdowns. And the government ended up giving out billions of dollars.
Billions with a B. Wow, that's a lot of money. But I'm kind of confused. When I think about struggling artists, I think, you know, like people playing small gigs, people trying to like make it big. I don't really think of like Lil Wayne or Chris Brown. So how did people with, you know, that much money even get into this program in the first place?
Yeah, so that's where like one key detail comes in. The SBA, when they were evaluating applications, they mostly looked at lost revenue, not the assets of the people applying. So you could have hypothetically like a millionaire artist, and if their income dropped a lot because of the pandemic, they could still qualify.
So a loophole. Okay, that makes sense. That kind of explains how some of these big names ended up getting funds. So let's get down to it. What exactly are Lil Wayne and Chris Brown be accused of doing with this money?
Well, let's start with Lil Wayne. The article says he got a pretty big chunk of change, like $8.9 million from this SVOG program. And instead of using that money, you know, to support his team or reinvest in his music or cover essential business costs, he allegedly spent over $1.3 million on private jet travel and another like $460,000 on high-end clothes.
Well, hold on. Private jets and designer clothes,
That's
that doesn't exactly sound like someone's struggling financially. What about Chris Brown? What's going on with him?
So his company, CDE Touring, they got $10 million, and $5.1 million of that allegedly went straight to Brown. The article says he spent something like $80,000 on his own birthday party. Like, we're talking atmosphere models, an LED dance floor, bottle service, nitrogen ice cream. Oh, and he spent like $24,000 on a tour bus ride to Tulum.
Okay, I gotta say, even with everything going on in the world at the time, a $24,000 tour bus to Tulum it just seems off.
Yeah.
Especially since this money was supposed to help people who were, you know, really struggling to survive during this global crisis. Yeah. So I'm trying to wrap my head around like the ethics of it all. These are artists who, by any standard, are doing pretty well financially. Does it raise any ethical flags when they take this aid when they're already wealthy?
Yeah, I think it brings up a ton of questions. It's this tension between what the SVOG program was supposed to be, like this lifeline for people really in trouble, and the reality of how the money seems to have been used in some cases. You know, it feels like maybe the spirit of the program wasn't really upheld.
Yeah, it does seem like there's a disconnect somewhere. But let's zoom out a bit.
Yeah.
It's easy to get caught up in what Lil Wayne and Chris Brown supposedly spent. But are there other artists who have been accused of misusing SVOG funds? Is this like a bigger issue within the music industry?
Yeah, that's a great question.
And the answer is yes. The Vice CE article mentions quite a few other artists, actually, like Alice in Chains, Steve Aoki, and even Marshmello. He supposedly gave his own company the entire $9.9 million grant.
Wow. Okay, that's quite a list. It's starting to feel like more than just a couple of isolated incidents. What do you think? Is this a sign of a bigger problem, like a lack of oversight in the SVOG program itself?
Yeah, it definitely raises some red flags. It makes you wonder how many other artists might have benefited from this loophole.
Right.
And what does this say about the systems in place? Like, are they even working to make sure taxpayer money is being used responsibly and for what it was actually intended for?
Right. Those are some big questions.
Yeah.
This deep dive is starting to feel less like a deep dive and more like we're diving into the Mariana Trench of ethical dilemmas here.
Yeah, I think that's a pretty good analogy.
Yeah.
But one thing that's really important to remember is that these are just allegations right now.
Right.
Neither Lil Wayne nor Chris Brown or any of the other artists mentioned have actually addressed these claims publicly.
Right. It's important to acknowledge that these are allegations at this point.
Yeah.
But even so, the investigation itself is really thought-provoking. What I'm finding interesting, and to be honest, a little disturbing, is how this situation could reveal something about government oversight and accountability,
Yeah.
especially during times of crisis.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
It makes you wonder, doesn't it? Like, how do we balance the urgency of getting aid out quickly with the need for, like, thorough checks and balances?
Yeah.
Is there even a way to prevent this kind of potential misuse of funds
Yeah.
without creating roadblocks for the people who really need the help?
Those are definitely questions that deserve further exploration.
Yeah.
I feel like we've just scratched the surface here.
Yeah, we have.
There's so much more to unpack and consider.
Absolutely. And that's exactly what we'll be doing in the next part of our deep dive.
Okay.
We'll be looking deeper into the potential consequences of these allegations, exploring the legal stuff, and talking about what the situation might tell us about the whole complicated relationship between government aid and the entertainment industry.
Sounds good.
Yeah.
Okay, so we've been talking about these allegations surrounding the use of SVOG funds by some pretty big musicians. And it definitely raises a lot of questions about finding that balance between getting aid out quickly and making sure there's accountability.
Yeah, it really is like trying to walk a tightrope, isn't it? On the one hand, you have this urgent need to get funds to the people who are struggling. But on the other, you have to be responsible and make sure that taxpayer money is actually being used wisely and ethically.
Right, and we've established that the program was designed with good intentions. But as we've seen, there seem to have been some cracks in the system, cracks that some people may have taken advantage of. But even if, hypothetically, everything was done by the book, legally speaking, does accepting millions in aid when you're already wealthy, does that really sit right ethically?
That's a really interesting point. I think it comes down to moral responsibility, right?
Yeah.
Should individuals with a lot of personal wealth, should they feel obligated to turn down government assistance, even if they technically qualify? It's a tough one.
Yeah, it's a tough one. And I imagine public perception plays a role here, too. What do you think this news has done to the image of these artists? Especially considering that, they rely so much on their public image for their careers.
Yeah, it's definitely a hit to their reputation.
Right.
The court of public opinion can be pretty brutal. And once that trust is broken,
Right.
it can be hard to win back.
Yeah.
Being accused of misusing funds that were meant for people in desperate need, well, that can erode public trust and ultimately affect their fan base.
It's almost like a breach of trust, isn't it?
It is.
These are people that a lot of people look up to, admire,
Yeah.
and to see them potentially taking advantage of a system that's supposed to help those less fortunate, well, it can be pretty disillusioning.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I think it serves as a reminder that public figures, especially those in the entertainment industry, they're held to a higher standard.
Yeah.
Their actions are always under scrutiny. And any misstep, even a perceived one, can have huge consequences.
That's true. Okay, so we've talked about the ethical stuff and the reputational stuff, but what about the legal ramifications? If these allegations are true, what are these artists actually facing? Are we talking like a slap on the wrist, or is it more serious than that?
Well, it really depends on the specifics of each case. The severity of the consequences will likely depend on how much misuse there was, whether it can be proven that it was intentional, and whether any laws were actually broken.
Right.
But generally speaking, misusing government funds can lead to a whole bunch of penalties. We could be talking fines, repayment of the funds,
Right.
or in some cases, even criminal charges.
Yeah, the stakes are pretty high. It's not just about public embarrassment. There could be some serious legal trouble as well. It makes you wonder if the risk is even worth it. Like, what did they really gain from allegedly misusing these funds? A few luxury items. It seems like a pretty risky gamble for a relatively small payoff.
Yeah, that's a good point. It does seem out of proportion. It raises questions about their decision-making process, and maybe even a lack of understanding about what could happen.
Yeah, for sure. So out of everything we've discussed so far, what do you think is the biggest takeaway from this situation? Is it the potential misuse of funds?
Yeah.
The ethical stuff? Or what this could mean for government programs going forward?
I think what I find most compelling, and maybe even most concerning, is how this could potentially damage public trust.
Oh, yeah.
These types of situations can make people doubt the effectiveness and the fairness of government programs that are supposed to be helping those in need. And that can have a ripple effect. It can make it harder to get support for these types of initiatives in the future.
That's a really good point. Yeah, it's bigger than just this one program.
Yeah.
Or these specific artists.
Yeah.
It's about the bigger picture,
It is.
about maintaining faith in the systems that we rely on during times of crisis.
Exactly.
So where do we go from here? What can we learn from this?
Right.
How do we prevent this from happening again in the future? Can we tighten up the process without making it so complicated that it stops people who really need help from getting it?
Those are the million-dollar questions, aren't they?
They really are.
It's all about balance.
Right.
We want to make sure people are accountable.
Right.
But we don't want to create a system that's so burdensome that it becomes impossible for those who really need it to access it. It's going to take a very careful approach.
Yeah, it sounds like it.
There are no easy answers.
Yeah.
But maybe by looking at what went wrong in the past and analyzing what led to this potential misuse, maybe we can come up with a system that's both efficient and ethical.
So it sounds like there needs to be a team effort here, like both government agencies and people in the industry need to work together to create a system that's stronger and more resilient to these kinds of issues.
Exactly.
So what are some concrete steps that can be taken to strengthen oversight and prevent misuse of funds in the future?
Well, there are a few things we could consider. First, we could make the vetting process for applicants more rigorous.
Okay.
Instead of just looking at lost revenue. We could also take into account their overall financial situation.
All right, so not just focusing on whether their income took a hit, but also looking at their overall wealth and their ability to weather the storm, so to speak.
Excellent.
Okay, that seems reasonable. What else? Are there ways to make things more transparent and hold people accountable once the money has been distributed?
Yeah, transparency is key.
Mm-hmm.
We could require more detailed reporting on how the funds are actually being used, conduct regular audits to make sure people are following the rules, maybe even create a public database that tracks how the money is being spent.
Right, so everyone can see where the money is going.
Exactly.
Okay, makes sense. Sunlight is the best disinfectant, right?
Exactly.
Okay, so what about deterrence? Like, what can we do to stop people from even thinking about misusing these funds in the first place? Should there be stricter penalties?
I think stronger penalties are definitely part of the solution.
Okay.
But we also need to cultivate a culture of ethical behavior within the industry itself.
So it's not just about external controls and regulations. It's about creating an environment where doing the right thing is the norm, not the exception.
Exactly.
Okay, but how do we actually do that?
Well, it's a multifaceted approach.
Okay.
Industry leaders need to set a good example by prioritizing ethical financial practices and holding themselves and their teams accountable.
So leading by example. I like that.
Yeah.
But what about the people who might see something wrong happening,
Yeah.
but are afraid to speak up? I mean, sometimes fear of retaliation or hurting their career can keep people silent.
Yeah, that's a very valid concern.
Yeah.
Protecting whistleblowers is essential.
Mm-hmm.
We need to create safe and confidential ways for people to report suspected misuse of funds.
Right, so they can speak up without fear of getting in trouble.
Exactly.
Okay, so creating a space where speaking truth to power, even when it's hard, is actually encouraged and protected.
Right.
That seems like a really important step in creating a system that's more ethical and accountable.
It is.
Yeah.
It takes a multifaceted approach.
It does. It's clear that there's no magic bullet here. But a combination of these measures could really help prevent these kinds of situations from happening again in the future.
I agree.
So we've covered a lot of ground here. What we've discovered isn't just about a handful of artists and their questionable spending. It's about the complexities of government aid, ethical decision-making, and the importance of public trust.
You said it perfectly.
And as we move into the final part of our deep dive,
Okay.
I think it's important to shift our focus to you, the listener.
That's a great idea.
Yeah, what does the situation mean for you? What questions does it raise for you personally?
Exactly.
We've dug into the allegations,
Right.
explored the potential consequences, and even brainstormed some solutions.
We have.
But at the end of the day, what really matters is how this resonates with each of you listening.
Absolutely.
So as we wrap up this part,
Okay.
I want you to take a minute and reflect. What are your takeaways from this conversation? How does this situation change how you think about government aid, ethical responsibility, and the role of public figures in our society? What questions are you still thinking about? All right, so we've spent this deep dive looking into this pretty complex issue. You know, these allegations of misuse of COVID relief funds in the music industry. It really highlights those challenges of balancing urgent need with making sure those resources are used responsibly.
Yeah, and we've kind of gone through the ins and outs of the SVOG program and talked about those ethical questions around, artists who are already well off getting this in that was meant for people in real need. And we've even touched on some of the legal and reputational consequences that could come out of these allegations.
Yeah, but I think what I find most interesting, even beyond the specifics of this particular case, is what this says about the bigger picture. It really makes you think about, individual responsibility versus collective accountability, especially during a crisis like this. And we talked about, there might be some loopholes in how the program was designed, and that there's a need for better oversight to prevent this kind of thing from happening again. But how do we make sure that these changes actually lead to real reform?
Right. Well, it's going to take a multi-pronged approach. First, there have to be a real commitment from policymakers to actually prioritize accountability and transparency within these programs. It's not just about creating new rules. There needs to be a shift in the culture towards actually doing the right thing, being responsible with public funds.
So a shift from just checking boxes to actually living up to the spirit of these programs.
Exactly.
Yeah, that makes sense. But it can't just come from the top down, can it? I mean, it seems like individuals, both in the industry and just everyday people, have a role to play here too.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
We as citizens have a responsibility to stay informed about how our tax dollars are being used and to hold our elected officials accountable for making sure these programs are being run fairly and effectively.
So being active citizens, doing our research, speaking up when we see something that doesn't look right.
Exactly.
Okay, so those are all important steps. But what about the ethical side of things? We touched on that moral dilemma of, wealthy people accepting aid that's meant for those who are really struggling. How do we encourage a stronger sense of ethical responsibility, not just in the music industry, but in all parts of society?
I think it starts with building a culture of empathy and understanding.
Okay.
It's easy to get so caught up in our own lives and our own problems that we forget that other people might be dealing with much bigger challenges.
Right.
We need to make a conscious effort to, look beyond ourselves and think about the needs of others.
So fostering a sense of shared responsibility.
Right.
Recognizing that we're all in this together. And that what we do as individuals can impact the well-being of other people.
Exactly.
It seems like that kind of change in mindset is so important for creating a society that's more just and equitable.
It really is.
And it's not just about these grand gestures or huge policy changes. It's about the choices we make every day.
It is.
It's about asking ourselves, am I using my resources responsibly? Am I thinking about the needs of others? Am I contributing to a culture where fairness and accountability matter?
Those are some really important questions to consider.
They are. And it brings us back to the core of this whole deep dive. It's not just about a few artists and how they may or may not have spent some money. It's about looking at our own values, how we understand ethical behavior, and what role we play in creating a society where resources are shared fairly and used responsibly.
Couldn't have said it better myself.
And as we wrap up this exploration,
Okay.
I want to leave you with one last thought.
All right.
The pandemic was a tough time for everyone.
It was.
A lot of hardship and loss.
Yeah.
But it also gave us a chance to rethink our priorities, to figure out what really matters,
It did.
and to consider how we can work together to build a better future, one that's more resilient and more equitable. This deep dive has been quite a journey, uncovering some uncomfortable truths, looking at those flaws in the system, and grappling with some really tough ethical questions. But it's also been a call to action, a chance to start a conversation, to hold ourselves and our leaders accountable, and to work towards a world where help gets to those who need it most, and where that help is used to lift up and empower communities. Thanks for joining us on this thought-provoking journey.
Sound the alarm. I'm coming up. We'll have a ball. I'm sweet like a buttercup. You're a Barbie doll. Show them all what I'm made